Ableton has a massive problem, and I think that this problem is holding back the software and it's not giving you the full potential of what Ableton should be as a music production program. Now, this problem is very complex, and some of the things that actually happen due to this problem is a little bit strange to explain. It also seems to happen in very rare circumstances. I'm not always able to reproduce this, but I think I've figured out what the problem is, and I want to explain it to you so that you don't fall into it, as well as address it and hopefully make it known to the wider Ableton community so it can actually be fixed.
Hello, I quickly wanted to say if you want to support this channel, you can do so by listening to my music on Spotify or Apple Music, or by going to my website and looking at some of my products. There are even free ones that you can download really easily. Alternatively, if you're interested in private lessons, I also provide those, and all the information for that you can also find on my website.
So what am I talking about here? Here we have the project that I'm using to test for this problem. And as you can see, there's 3 components to it. We have a group here, which holds some sources, some audio that we want to render. We have a bus here, where everything gets summed to. So this goes into the bus. And then this bus goes into my final master, which is then part of my master group. Now, the reason why that other project is set up that way is because it is a kind of smaller representation of what my template looks like. Here we have our groups, there's multiple of them. Then inside this group we have all of our summing buses. You can see this goes to the drums, this goes to the basses, this goes to the leads, and those are these tracks here. And then these send it all to my master out, which is my final master track, which sits within my out group. So there you can see the correspondence between my actual projects and the project that I just showed. So going back to this, let's say that you have a project here. I have some white noise on here because it gives us a nice look at the waveform. And I have a drum loop, which also will be handy in a little bit. But what we can see is that we have a few elements in here, and say that I wanted to render one of these elements or even multiple of these elements. For now, we're just going to render source 1, and let's say that we just render it like this. You might have something like this where you have your tracks, you have your sum bus, and then on your final master you have whatever master chain that you want. Here I just put a few plugins that I tend to use. They're obviously not actually set up because I'm not really mastering anything, but this is just to show you kind of what the problem is about. We have a few plugins on our master chain. So if I now go in and hit export, I'm just going to export this part here. These are the settings that I want to use. I go to export and I'll call this noise. I'm exporting it to the current project, but where you export doesn't really matter. As you can see here, we have our noise file. Now let's drag this in and actually see what happens. And that's very strange. There's a little dropout here. So what is this? What is happening here? Why do we have this little gap here? What I found with a setup like this is that having anything on your master chain will induce kind of a delay, obviously, and that delay needs to be compensated. And something goes wrong within the delay compensation that just turns your sound off for a specific amount of time. Now, I have been exporting a lot of my stems for the album so that I can mix them in separate projects. That's something that I've been experimenting with. And obviously this is a very large problem. I had to re-render a lot of stuff because of this issue. And later on, I'll also talk a little bit about a secondary problem, which I also have with Ableton. Now that I'm talking about Ableton problems, I might as well cover that too. But the combination of those two problems basically means that I spent a lot longer on rendering out individual tracks than I should have. So you might say, okay, there's a little bit of an error here and we can just fix that by, taking whatever is here, cutting out that little bit of silence, and we'll cut right here, maybe something like that. If we just remove this, we can just line these two things up and then we have our original audio file back. But that's not the case. So let's actually look at that. Let's render out this drum track here. And now if we place the drums in here, you can see that it's not a timing issue. There is no actual delay being introduced. What happens is there's just a little bit of silence. You can see this lines up, but here we have just a little dropout. So you're actually losing information here. Now to actually fix this, what you would need to do is you would need, in a setup like this, obviously if you're using, for example, my templates that I've given away for download many times, then this is a problem that you get into. What you would need to do is you would need to turn off any mastering plugins here. So now if I render them out like this again, I'll go drums 2, we can see that we no longer have that issue. Now you can see that there are some differences between like the waveforms, between this one and this one, which without any effects on them, you shouldn't think would be the case. What I think happens here is that this is warping. It looks a lot like warping to me. Kind of this is like reversing into here, something like that. So if you notice those waveform changes, that's probably what's going on there. But notably what you can see is that we no longer have this gap here. But that's not really a solution, that's more of a limitation. You're basically saying you cannot render anything through this setup if you have mastering plugins enabled. Now for me, this isn't the biggest problem, because whenever I export things for mixing purposes, I don't want to have any mastering stuff on there anyway. What I have found that in very large projects, like in actual finished songs, even just having a disabled track like this is a problem. So I would need to make a separate project where I just completely delete all of my mastering plugins, and that way I can use that secondary project to actually render out all of the sounds. Now obviously that isn't the best solution, but it is okay for me. The biggest problem that I have with this whole setup is what comes next, and that is how you need to export individual tracks. You might have seen when I started exporting that I was using these buttons here or the solo buttons here to export. And what I would like to do is actually export multiple things at once. So let's say that this is my track here. We have a drum loop and some noise, and I want to export these two as individual stems. But before I do that, I want to EQ them both to remove any of the sub bass. So what I'll do is I'll take this, I'll put an EQ on it, turn it up like up until here, and then that's okay. So now there's two ways to do it. I can go into Ableton and hit the export, and then I can say all individual tracks or selected tracks only. In that case, I would need to select these tracks and export them. I can say selected tracks only. I'll export. I'll just call this cell, and then with a dash, it will start rendering everything, and it renders everything very, very fast. Very nice, you would say. The only problem is, if we now look in the waveform, and especially if we take a spectrum, we can see there's still some stuff in here. Our actual high pass has not been printed in here. And the reason for this is that when you're using selected tracks or all individual tracks, it will actually take the output of this individual tracks and it won't make any considerations of any groups that it is put in. So what this means is that you basically cannot use groups within your project if you want to export that way and export quickly. Otherwise, what you need to do is you need to solo one, and then you can render it out. We'll go master, export, solo source 1. And if we look at that one now, we can see that the lowest part has actually been removed. So if you have any groups within your project, you need to do this solo, and you need to do that for every track. Now in this track that doesn't seem that big of a problem, but let's hop over to a different project of mine. So this is a very big project of mine. Now this isn't an average project, this one was specifically made to be very complex, and therefore it has a lot more tracks than any other of my projects. But this is a good example of where this is becoming a problem. So the first thing is that obviously we have almost 200 tracks in this project. You can see here 199. Now not all of these are tracks that I need to render out. Part of these are these groups, and then we have all of these tracks here, which are like another 20, I think, 17. So let's say that we have around 180 to 170 tracks that I actually need to render out. One of the issues is that you need to go in and do every individual track. The other issue, and this is obviously just because rendering takes a little bit of time, and the longer it is, the longer that time is going to be, and the more complex a project is, the more complex it's going to be. So when I render out individual tracks, say like, for example, I don't know, my kick group here, it takes a whole long time to render this out. So basically what I'll do is I'll solo it, render this, and then I'll wait for this obviously to finish. And in the meantime, I'm doing other things. So I have this on my second or my third monitor or whatever. And I just look over once in a while. Now rendering this track out, you would think, okay, it would only have to load a few plugins. Let's say all of these and whatever is within this group and whatever goes through this drum group and helpers and stuff like that. But the other big issue is that when you solo things, it doesn't actually unload any of these other tracks which are not being played. You can actually see that if I play some of this track. You can see we have volume meters for all of these elements here, so you can see those are still playing. Which means that these are still taking up resources that could be used to make the rendering more efficient. Now when rendering something, it is the same as just playing something, only faster to make the waveform as fast as possible. The soloing system works the same. We are basically playing tracks and rendering tracks that we're not using. So to work around this problem, what I would basically need to do is I would need to give up my whole project structure like this, and I would need to put everything into individual tracks, never use a group track ever again. That way I can use the render all selected track features, or I would need to spend sometimes days rendering out projects like this. A project like this is going to take me more than a day to render out, but just let's say that every track takes me, I don't know, 15 minutes, 20 maybe. My system isn't the best system, so that's a reasonable guess. Especially with a project like this, which is so massive and also so long. One of the things to remember is that this project is like exceptionally big. We can see it being almost 12 minutes long as well. So this is obviously like exaggerated in the terms of what it actually means. But it is a great example of the worst case scenario. And I think these two problems, the previously mentioned render issues with the plugin delay compensation and that silence, as well as the way I have to render out my projects to actually make them work, to actually get individual stamps. It is taking an action which should take me minutes to set up and then one click to execute into something that takes me days, and I sometimes just have to completely redo because I forgot to turn off a plugin or something. So what do I want to see changed? Well, for one, what I think is happening is that this delay compensation problem, it is coming from the fact that Ableton was originally designed as more of a live performance tool rather than a DAW. But let's get real here for a second. I think most people use Ableton nowadays not as a live performance tool, but as a DAW. A lot of people just use it to produce something when they're in the studio and they never actually take it out for a live set. So I think there should be an option for you to have a performance mode and maybe a production mode, something like that. And what that would do is it would change the plugin, the way the plugin delay compensation works, so that you no longer have these rendering issues. Another issue that people tend to have is with tools like LFO tool and any other timing based tool, they tend to get off sync with the project if you have multiple plugins before it, especially with big latency in it. The plugin delay compensation doesn't actually compensate them well enough for you to be able to use them normally. And I've never heard of any other DAW having this issue. So there's definitely something specific to the delay compensation within Ableton that makes it so that this happens. And I think there is something to say for it. From a live philosophy, what we don't want is we don't need everything to be timed perfectly together. What we need is a very fast response time, because when I start playing, I want to be able to hear and, output whatever I'm playing as fast as possible. That's very important. But in a studio environment, especially if you're not recording, but you are producing, like I am doing, I don't care about latency. I can press play and have it wait half a second for it to catch up to whatever it needs to do, and then actually play the sound. What I'm interested in from my plugin delay compensation is that everything is synced up nicely and that there's no discrepancies in the timing that, for example, LFO tool gets versus the actual sound coming in. Or that there's no random gaps of silence at the start of exports. That seems very obvious to me. So in the next iteration of Ableton, I would love to see a way to switch between these two types of plugin delay compensation, if that would be possible. The second feature that I would like to request is a way for us to have that selected track options but to allow for groups and stuff like that. So to go back to the screen, anytime you select all individual tracks or selected tracks only, or any of these tracks here, if you want to export a single track, what it would give you is it would give you another option where you can say 3 track as if soloed, or 3 tracks if you have multiple selected as if they are soloed. And instead of taking the output from the individual track itself, what it should do is it should take every track, solo it, and then render it out. That way I can just turn on this action and I don't have to go back every 10 to 20 minutes, whatever time it takes for me to render out an individual track, and then reset up the next track and the next track. That would save me a whole lot of time of having to look out for this action, which in my opinion could be very easily automated. So that's going to be it for today. Now the reason why I'm making this video is 1, I hope to get attention to this to actually get this problem solved. And 2, I would like to not only for this problem to be solved, but also to help people who have been running into these problems understand what is going on. Because from a surface level, it's not really easy to understand actually what is happening here, what is causing these issues. It really took me a few months of constantly exporting with different settings and different options, and then finally turning off my, for example, mastering plugins to really realize, okay, this is what is causing this gap. In these videos, I obviously make it seem like it's very easy. Okay, you turn off your mastering plugins and you don't have that problem anymore. But that's not the case. I've had points in time where just bypassing the mastering plugins didn't work. I had to actually delete them, for example. So even after months of exporting tracks like this, I still don't have 100% certainty in actually saying that, okay, I understand what is happening here. But hopefully I was at least able to shed a little bit of light on this problem, and hopefully together we can get this to the people at Ableton and hopefully get all of this stuff fixed. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.